Okay, so my name is Adrienne Kaminsky, even though it does say Sapino on there. I am currently working in Everett Public Schools in Massachusetts as an instructional coach for SEI. What that basically means is that I work with mainstream teachers or general content teachers. And we work together to help the EL students in their class be successful.
Cool. I'm Rachel Dantzler, and I'm currently a curriculum developer at a grammar company in New York. And I was previously an adult ELL teacher online.
Very
so
good.
We're talking about formative assessment today. So what did you learn from the article that we both read about formative assessment?
So I think one of the most important points that they brought up was the actual definition of a formative assessment. I feel like when I first started teaching, I was like, what is the difference between a formative and a summative assessment? I had never heard those terms before. And this article sort of clearly defines a formative assessment as being the process of, I guess, monitoring student abilities and whether or not they understand while you're actually instructing the students, so that you know where you have to go next, basically. So if a student doesn't quite understand what's going on during the class, then you're not going to find out at the end when you're doing a summative assessment. You'll know immediately, and you'll be able to redirect that student.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. In my mind, after reading this, I started thinking about how formative assessment in a lot of ways is more important in some ways than summative assessment, because once you have the results at the end of the year from a yearly summative assessment, you don't have the kids anymore to help them improve. But if you're doing formative assessment, it's ongoing, basically. And I want to talk a little bit about formative versus summative, because that's something I didn't know either before this course, really. Something that really stood out to me is that there's not very much research done on formative, and a lot of research done on summative. And at the beginning, I was surprised by that. And then I realized maybe it's because these bigger companies that have money have paid for research studies for summative assessments to make, to have research to back them up. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I agree with you that the summative assessments are very easily able to be researched because, like you said, these big companies have the money to be able to carry out that research. But another thing that I noticed that they mentioned in the article was that formative assessments, because you're kind of working on the fly, in using, what students are giving you to then draw more information from them. It's not as easy to test as a summative assessment because it's very dynamic and it's always changing.
Right.
So I guess it makes sense that they wouldn't have very much research on formative assessments if they're so dynamic, because in one moment you may ask a student a question, they may not quite understand the question, then you can reformulate the question or rephrase it and then get the answer that you were looking for, whereas these big summative exams aren't going to do that. The question is there. Oftentimes the question is there, and the student doesn't get the opportunity to really dig into it and say, I don't understand what this means. They just have to take a shot.
Right. That's a good point. I hadn't thought about how it might be even more difficult to research it because it's on the fly, like you said. That makes me think about, I'll go to this slide. It's this number 2 stuff. So how formative assessment can be informal or formal. I thought that was interesting because I think I went in with thought that all formative assessment was the same. And I thought they were going to say, this is what it is. And it's this one thing. Mm-hmm. But they had this list of it could be on the fly, which is the most informal stuff versus, planned, curriculum embedded. And I think I realized that when I was teaching ELLs, I did a lot of on the fly formative assessment, even though I thought I wasn't doing any assessment at all. But an example, I guess, would be if I notice that they made a preposition mistake, then kind of drilling in and asking more questions involving prepositions, and then planning a lesson in the future on prepositions based on it. I guess that could be an example of formative assessment. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, totally. I think that's definitely an example of formative assessment, because you're asking them a question in the moment to see if they're understanding one of the goals or objectives of your class, and then, using the information that you garner from their response to sort of inform your teaching later. And that's really the whole purpose of formative assessment.
Right.
In terms of these principles, one of the things that I thought was most important was number 4, where they talk about using learning progressions to anchor learning goals and to monitor learning. And I think that, this statement that we have written under here, goals must be communicated to students or even co-created with them, is really important, because I've definitely, at the beginning of my teaching career, had noticed that, like, when my goals were not clearly communicated to the students, the class in question it wasn't very focused. The students were not really able to hone in on the skill as much as I would have liked them to. But when I very clearly communicated the goal at the start of class and told it to the students and we talked about it, they were really able to sort of run with it, and, hone in on it. And so that sort of kind of goes in with principle number 6, where it enables students to become self-regulated and autonomous learners, because then they know as well, like, what we're aiming for. So, they know what they're supposed to be getting out of this class, really enabling them to be more autonomous in their learning. Whereas I think sometimes people, when they don't communicate the goal to the student, it ends up just being like, all right, well, what's, is this a surprise? Like, what are we supposed to be learning? Aren't we supposed to know too? But, like, sometimes we don't. And I've been in classes like that as well, where I'm kind of sitting there going, what am I supposed to be doing? Like, what am I supposed to be getting out of this? And it's so much easier, and I feel so much more in control when somebody tells me what the objective of the class is.
Yeah, I agree. Number 6 really stood out to me too. It just, like, put a lot more faith in the students' abilities, rather than just saying, like, you're teaching at them, like, having them be a part of the learning is really nice. I like that.
Yeah.
I want to kind of maybe talk about, like, eliciting evidence through formative assessment. Mm-hmm. Do you have any thoughts on that?
So I think that the last point on here, where it talks about how the teacher has to be careful that the evidence that they're eliciting is, that they're eliciting evidence for the targeted point of instruction, or the skill that they're trying to get the students to learn. I feel like I've definitely been in classes and definitely have given assessments where, the skill that I'm assessing them on wasn't necessarily the targeted skill. Right. And I know that sounds stupid now, but sometimes when you're working from a set curriculum and you have to use the curricular materials that are being provided to you, or people say, just use the curricular materials that are being provided to you. Those materials are not necessarily what's resonating with what you're teaching, or not necessarily resonating with what you're teaching in class. Like, maybe you've sort of gone off in a little bit of a different direction. You can't then go back and use those materials to assess students, because that's not what you were focused on. And I think that happens all the time, actually.
Yeah, I was going to say it probably gets more difficult with, like, assessing content and language at the same time, which this article talked about a lot in regards to, Common Core standards and everything. Mm-hmm. That probably makes it more complicated. You might accidentally be testing things you don't realize you are,
Right. Yeah. I mean, there have definitely been, and I mean, I don't, as a person who is developing curriculum, like, what is your opinion on that? Because the curriculum that we use for the middle school in the district that I work in, sometimes I look at the tests and I'm like, this wasn't something that we really talked about. Like, this doesn't really seem to be getting at any of the skills that the chapter was focused on. Like, why are we testing them on this? This is like very random. Like, what do you think about that?
I love that question. I feel like it's like a big part of my job to try to not include prior information, prior knowledge, not require that of students, prior knowledge, because it's a grammar resource. We're trying to teach like the grammar by itself, but it's hard to do that without, vocabulary.
Right.
And so that, but also that it's an online resource. So you're testing typing as well by accident.
Yeah.
So I think
that's a really good point.
Yeah. So it's something I've run into a lot. And I feel like teachers, even in the classroom, run into it without the typing issue, especially when teaching both content and language.
Oh my gosh, you're totally right.
Is there anything else you wanted to add? I feel like we're about out of time.
No, I think that we pretty much hit it all.
Awesome. Yeah.
Great. All right. Let me see.